Hello and welcome to our weekly look at events inside Syria. I'm Shakun Tilasantharan. Almost a week has passed since the Arab League observers arrived in Syria, but despite their presence on the ground, the bloodshed continues. While opposition activists have been deeply skeptical of the observer mission, the outpouring of demonstrators across Syria on Friday underscores their wish to make their case to the foreign monitors and to take advantage of the small measure of safety they feel they brought with them. Hundreds of thousands of protesters took to the streets around the country, emboldened by the presence of the Arab League observers. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says monitors visited Idlib, Hama, Dera and Homs on Friday, yet at least 35 people were killed across Syria. Witnesses say government snipers were seen firing into the crowds. While with frustration mounting in Syria, activists say the Arab League monitors aren't doing enough to stop the violence. New video has emerged of one monitor trying to reason with angry crowds.
We saw snipers in the town. We saw them with our own eyes. We're going to ask the government to remove them immediately. We'll be in touch with the Arab League back in Cairo. If the snipers are not gone in 24 hours, then there will be other measures taken. But everything has to be done with understanding and with organization. Excuse me. Let me say this. This mission hasn't had any results. You haven't told us your issues, and we haven't been able to. You're telling me there are snipers? I saw the snipers. You don't have to tell me. I saw them with my own eyes.
The head of the opposition Syrian National Council says that more than 3,000 observers will be needed to properly monitor the country. Boran Galyona said there are indications that the situation in Syria is heading towards the United Nations Security Council.
Should the regime fail in fulfilling the commitments that it has taken upon itself, then there will be no option left for us except to go to the United Nations Security Council. And I believe that matters are heading in that direction at the moment. We are going to the Security Council. As you have seen, the regime still resorts to snipers, thugs, and still prevents people from demonstrating in public.
Well, joining us now are our guests in Beirut, retired Brigadier General and military strategist Elias Hanna. In San Francisco, Assad Abukhalil, a professor of political science at California State University. And in Washington, D.C., Ahed al-Hendi, a program coordinator for the U.S.-based human rights organization cyberdissident.org. He's also the founder of Syrian Youth for Justice. Welcome, gentlemen. Ahed, if I could start with you, we saw huge rallies in various Syrian cities on Friday, including Douma, a suburb of Damascus. How significant is this show of defiance? We haven't seen any protests of this size near the capital before.
No, Douma has been protesting since the beginning of the revolution, since the early days of the revolution. But in Damascus, in many areas of Damascus, like Al-Midan, it's the heart of Damascus, we have seen a mass protest inside Midan and many Damascene suburb. However, the rich area of Damascus, because it has like a tight control from the Syrian security, we haven't witnessed much of protest inside these areas. But Damascus didn't stop from protesting since the beginning of the revolution. And the first day of the revolution, which was March 15th, it started in Damascus.
Okay, well, Elias, the people protesters seemingly emboldened by the presence of the Arab League monitors in the country. What sort of credibility do you think the Arab League mission has?
The mission of these observers has its own flaws, internal conflict, internal flaws, internal problems. Why? Because when you have like 60 or 70, could be like 200 tomorrow or after tomorrow, logistically speaking, they are not really able to monitor the situation. Moreover, the structure, you monitor, you see things, you do your report and you send it, and then what to do about it? You know what I mean? So this is a problem for the Arab League as well as a problem for the Syrian regime. Now, when we talk about Damascus or we talk about Aleppo, this is the main issues. This is the two central center of gravity for the regime. So that's why the meaning of these protests today in the presence of these observers. So having a mass demonstration in Damascus today, while you have some observers, it means that this regime is trying to control Damascus at the center of gravity, where you have the center of power, as well as Aleppo. So if you want to monitor the situation, any changes in these two big cities of Syria, it's going to have real meanings for the next period in the Syrian revolution.
Now, Assad, next question to you. Despite the Arab League observers being on the ground, people continue to be killed. Is the mission doomed to fail, as one anonymous Arab League observer said?
Well, it seems to me that if we want to lay blame, and we should, about this mission by the Arab League so-called monitors, we should list the culprits. I mean, on the first hand, I mean, it has been folly to assume that the collection of Arab tyrannies of the GCC who are running the affairs of the Arab League right now are in any position to recognize human rights violation when they see them. I mean, these are governments that cannot recognize human rights violation if they hit them in the face. And the second fault, of course, should be to the Syrian regime itself. The regime still, by virtue of holding the threads of power, assume full responsibility for whatever security deterioration and murder that goes on in Syria, regardless who is doing it. The third blame, I think, should fall on the so-called Syrian National Council. I mean, these replicas of Arab oppositions run by Gulf governments, as the Syrian National Council has become, should explain to the Syrian people why they have, for several weeks and months, insisted that the Arab League should send monitors, and now they saying that there is no purpose for these monitors. Or now I heard Burhan Ghalioun saying that the number should be added to 3,000 or so. I mean, I don't think they are capable of doing anything. And I think that a different strategy that would rely on the Syrian people themselves to be able to mount their own uprising, to overthrow the regime, should have been the real strategy. Otherwise, the affairs of running Syria and undertaking change in the country are going to be left, like in Libya, to NATO.
Okay, in the face of all this, let's take a look at the military and the prominent role that it's playing in the crackdown, firing on protesters and killing civilians. In Syria, there are 4 directorates operating under the umbrella of the National Security Council. They're headed by General Hisham Ightia, who reports directly to President Bashar al-Assad. Let's have a closer look at how the military is structured and who's in charge. Military intelligence is headed by General Abdul Fattah Qudsiya. He's from the Alawite minority, as is the president and his family. Military intelligence is considered the paramount security agency in Syria. A division of military intelligence is called the Palestine Branch. It's known as a harsh enforcer against political dissidents. Then there's the Republican Guard and 4th Division. Both are under the command of Maher al-Assad, the president's brother. Unofficially, there's a militia called Shabha, or thugs. They join the 4th Division and attack civilians in Syria's coastal cities. It's believed that they're headed by Assad's first cousins, Fawaz al-Assad and Munzir al-Assad. Then we have the Air Force Intelligence, headed by Major General Jamil Hassan, also a member of the Alawite minority. AFI is seen as the elite agency and has a reputation for brutality. Both the head of military intelligence and Air Force intelligence are Alawites. Then there are 2 more military directorates, both headed by Sunnis. The Political Security Directorate, headed by Deeb Zaitun. Deeb Zaitun is a Sunni. And finally, the State Security Directorate, headed by Ali Mamluk, also Sunni. It's believed that they're appointed over Alawites to help the Syrian government diffuse tensions with the general populace, who interact most often with the security chiefs. If I could come back to you, Ahed, does President Assad and his family have full control of the military?
Yeah, we think that he is the head of the army now in Syria, and his family and the National Security Council in Syria, which consists of him, his brother-in-law, and his brother and his paternal and maternal cousin, they are having a full control now over the army. And we're not speaking here about the defectors, speaking about the whole army. Most of the divisions in the Syrian armies, if they don't have a high-ranking Alawite officers, they have his deputy who is Alawite and is the strong person in the division. And so far, much of them are so loyal to Assad. And so I would believe he has a full control over the army. All the killing that is committed by the army, Bashar al-Assad is the one who is responsible for that.
Elias, there have been some defections, as Ahed was saying, but for the most part, why has the military stood by Assad and his family?
You know that as a whole, the military, the Syrian army is around like 250,000 people. But the core, the center of this army is not more than 60 to 70,000, which are controlled by the regime. Now, when we talk about defectors, we are talking about the conscripts. And conscripts in Syria for 2 years is not really enough to create what we call a professional army. Now, the conscripts, and they desert. Now, if you want to desert, now the balance is not really tipping in favor of the resistance. Why? Because if you want to monitor the conscript, deserting, you have to have a structure for this, what we call Syrian Free Army. You need a structure, you need equipment, you need training, you need command and control, and last but not least, which is the most important, you need a safe haven and you need a sponsor. So far, we don't have it, so that's why this army, or the core of the army of this regime, is still holding, and you don't see like a balance of power. Now, if you want to monitor something, you have to see the desertion, what kind of army, what kind of equipment, who is controlling this, and you have to monitor also the kind of operation that are done within the center of gravity of this regime. So far, we don't have it. If you want to see for the future, the major turning point would be a change in the policy of Turkey, like creating a safe haven for this free army, and they can operate and they can be trained and equipped and then go and make a military operation against the regime. So far, we don't have it.
Okay, without these elements, the killing continues. Assad, do you think the Syrian military will continue to listen to the Assad government?
Well, I mean, the signs are rather ominous. And I think that because the coverage of Syria on this network and others, Western as well as Eastern's, Saudi and Qatari media, have been characterized with so much propaganda and wishful thinking, we have lost we have lost touch with the core picture, which is the regime, whether we like it or not, and I certainly do not like it, has proven to be much more resilient than we had assumed all along. I mean, there has not been one defection in the diplomatic corps, one Syrian government defection. I know somebody is going to point out to deputy mayor of the assistant to the mayor in Dir'a or something like that. And at the high ranking of the military intelligence apparatus has remained largely intact. And the reason is, I mean, there is no question that the regime remains sectarian-based and very narrow. I mean, probably not as narrow as Gulf ruling dynasties, but still narrow. And I think, however, Bashar, unlike his father, has expanded the scope of power at the level of the commands of the military intelligence apparatus to a point to spread the spoils of corruption. I mean, that's how it operates. We're not talking about a professional army. We're talking about an army and intelligence apparatus that feeds on massive corruption that is permitted by the regime to keep everybody satisfied. And that extends to beyond the Alawite sect. I mean, I'm very worried about this focus on Alawites. Sometimes there's more than a tinge of prejudice and bigotry when we focus on that, because there are Alawites courageous who are opposed to the regime as well, just as there are Sunnis who are operating and working in cahoots with the regime in its suppression. So it seems to me the signs are that the regime seems to be able to maintain its resilience in the face of this genuine uprising that's going on. And I think partly because people inside Syria who are part of the functions of the government have made a calculation on whatever basis that the regime is not going to fall any time or any day soon. And this is when the decision is made by people to defect, and that's when the regime crumbles, as we've seen in Libya or Tunisia and elsewhere. These signs have not appeared as of yet in Syria. And I think also the strategy and the agenda of the dominant Syrian opposition of the Syrian National Council has facilitated the effort of the regime by dismissing it as a tool of outside GCC agendas and so on and so forth.
Okay, Ahed, back to you. Is there any chance that the Syrian army, the Syrian military, will switch sides like we saw in Tunisia and Egypt?
Well, we hope so. I don't see it in the soon future. As I mentioned, that the sectarian structure of the Syrian army is making this thing is very complicated in Syria. It's true what Mr. Abukhalil has said, that there's a lot of Alawite who they are opposing Assad, and there's a lot of Sunni who are working with Assad. But we can't deny the fact that the majority of the leading officers in the army, they came even from the village of Bashar al-Assad, al-Qardaha. So we have this tight loyalty to Assad from the army. But I do think also that these armies officers, most of them are like, you have a lot of people who they care about Syria, the country, and they might look and see what Assad has been doing with the country, and he is not only endangering himself and his family, he might be endangering his sect, the Alawite sect. And I think a lot of Alawite figures would not be interested of what Assad is doing now, and this would ask them to probably defect or like rebel against Assad.
Assad, go ahead.
But I mean, there's another problem. I mean, look, there's a big inconsistency that's being displayed by the Syrian National Council that is helping the regime itself. I mean, Burhan Ghaliun and the Syrian National Council is insisting that they are going to work in the transition for a new Syria with the Syrian army. So basically, they're sending a message that no matter how much killing the Syrian army is doing, and it is doing daily killing, we're going to do business with you. In other words, the Syrian army command, and of course there is sectarian basis to this regime, and nobody has denied that, but maybe Mr. Hindi misunderstood what I'm saying, but that's okay. The Syrian army is getting the message that they're going to be forgiven for their crimes, and as a result, they are going along with their crimes. And Bashar al-Assad is nowhere to be seen. He is not speaking to the Syrian people. He seems to be in a state of a coma. He bothers to speak to Barbara Walters, of all people, to address Western governments, but he's totally, I mean, he seems to be incapacitated politically, allowing the heads of the security intelligence apparatus to run the show. And that also is hampered by virtue not only of the massive corruption within their ranks, but by the infiltration by various foreign governments. Like, I mean, there are so many branches of the intelligence apparatus and army that you haven't mentioned. Like, there is al-Amn al-Siyasi, and there is political security apparatus, and there is military security apparatus, and so on. And some of them have an agenda that is beholden to Saudi Arabia or to Turkey, and so on. And as a result of that, I mean, the place is not as tightly run as one assumes. Certainly, it's not the way it was run under the ruthless father Hafez al-Assad. And that, in part, explains the fact that the military intelligence apparatus continue to operate ruthlessly and brutally without any serious defection thus far. And I think some of the action need to be taken should be by the elements of the leadership of the Syrian opposition in order to send a message that crimes will be accounted for if they are done by the army or the intelligence apparatus.
Elias, your thoughts.
Yes.
Is there any chance of a Tunisian or Egyptian scenario here?
No, I mean, you cannot compare the Syrian army to the Egyptian one. The history, the structure, the distribution of wealth and power is totally different. When you go to Egypt, for instance, you had this army that is highly active in the private sector, and they have like a turnover for more than 4 billion, and then they have like a representative in the presidency. Now, the change was like a white coup d'etat, like a soft coup d'etat in Egypt, because at that time, the coup d'etat was prepared by Hosni Mubarak to put his son instead of him as a follower of him. And his son is against the army, is the arch enemy of this army. So now you could separate the army from the presidency. In Libya, you had no army at that time. All it was is weak army and everything, the clientelism, around this Muammar Gaddafi. When you go to Syria, for 40 years, this army was prepared for this situation, the worst case scenario, how to preserve the regime. Now, this army or this regime in Syria, it has the army, there is no separation line. When we talk about civil-military relationship, in Syria, there is no civil-military relationship per se a la Western model. Now you have the army and the regime as one body. It's like lose-lose situation. If one loses, the other does, and vice versa. So you have you cannot really separate for it. Why? Because the pillars of this regime in Syria is the army, security apparatuses, and as well as the party, which is now marginal. And then you have the family and the Alawite. You cannot really talk about courageous Alawite today. Why? Because now a post-Assad regime, the Alawite will be seen by the Sunnis as their enemy. You cannot really separate between good Alawi and bad Alawis. And this is what makes the regime holding together and the security issues holding together. Keeping in mind that the regime is following a strategy, two-pronged strategy. One, outside, inside, not trying to make these deserters create a safe haven. Moreover, following a security approach on the demonstrators in Syria, and following an agenda of reform on his agenda as president.
Okay, so
I mean?
Nobody foresees any mass defections at this point. Ahed, can the Syrian people overthrow the Assad government? Can it win the revolution without the support of the military?
The Syrian people have been protesting for more than 9 months. So far, they have not stopped yet, despite the bloodshed that is happening. More than 6,000 of people were killed in the country. I think the people still have the faith and would keep the protest. But if we're going to speak logically, I mean, the Assad still has the power in the army. They have still they still have the deadly force. They're killing the people. They are opening fire. We have now the Arab League observer in the country. And so far, Assad regime has killed more than 38 people yesterday, despite the observers were there to protect the civilians. So I don't think that this regime, because Assad and all of his statements, the recent statements, he's persisting that what's happening is a conspiracy. He's not confessing that what's happening in Syria is a real demands from the Syrian people. So I think, unfortunately, if there would not be like an Arab League initiative, maybe Arab armies that come to Syria to protect the citizen, and which is very possible. I mean, many people are asking for that. Or even if it would go to the Security Council, we need a protection for the citizens. We need a support for the Free Syrian Army. We need buffering zone for the Free Syrian Army. This is a fact. We can't see our people being killed and be silent. We hope that the change in our country would become by ourselves, that Syrian people would go and topple this regime. But how would you do that if they have the tanks, they have the missiles, they have everything, and we only have our hands, and we only have like our chanting? So we hope that this would happen by inside, but I don't see it possible now.
Okay, Elias, you're shaking your head. Yes, please go ahead.
Both parties, demonstrators, opposition and the regime today, are in a stalemate situation. So in a stalemate situation, you need a third party. Here comes the role of the Arab League as, I think, as a transitional period to go to the United Nations Security Council. And I do oppose a little bit. I don't agree with Dr. Abukhalil that the NATO will interfere in Syria. It's totally different than Libya geographically, as a location, as a resources, and
of course it won't.
It
I did
won't,
not say it
because
will.
It cannot interfere first. Now, I think
of course
that
it won't.
after the withdrawal of the Americans from Iraq, they are following a strategy, low-cost benefit strategy, and like leaving the Syria for the Arabs, as for Turkey, as for Iran, and then try to see what's going to happen. But the stalemate will continue, and I think that the Syrian problem today is going to go for a long time.
So Assad, last word to you.
Of course, NATO is not going to intervene. This is exactly the complaint I have, is that the only people who can undertake change in Syria and build a new country are the Syrian people themselves. Unfortunately, the rhetoric and the propaganda of the Syrian opposition, which has become beholden to the GCC, is leaving people with the impression as if NATO bombers are on the way. And you and I know it's not going to happen. As a result, they are selling myth to the Syrian people, thereby allowing them to suspend their hope or to pin their hope on somebody else. And there's another problem, which is, how can the Syrian opposition address the very sector? I agree with what's said, which is the Alawites seems to be closing ranks. Why is that? Because they do not see any reassuring rhetoric from the Syrian opposition. What is the agenda of the Syrian opposition? What kind of Syria do they want to build? And why? If you want to speak in sectarian terms, the Druze, the Kurds, the Christians, the Alawites are, to a large measure, are not as fully participating. Why? Because there are strong sectarian, Salafi, fanatical tendencies within the Syrian leadership of the Ikhwan brothers and the other Salafis that are beholden to Qatar and Saudi Arabia, who are playing a very big role. And if you are a Syrian who want a secular government, you are not going to be deceived by believing that the promises of a civil government in Syria is going to be delivered by the likes of the Muslim Brotherhood of Syria. And this is why the regime continues to have a measure of resiliency.
Right. Gentlemen, so much more to discuss, but we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks very much to our guests, Elias Hanna, Assad Abukhalil, and Ahed al-Hendi. And to watch the show online, please go to our website, aljazeera.com. That's it from us for now. Please do join us next week when we take another look inside Syria. Happy New Year. Have a great start to 2012.